This is a sloth. And this is his wife. And these are his children, the loves of his life. The younger they are, the cuter they get. And here is Stanley, the smallest one yet. Now, a sloth is the laziest creature you'll meet. And Stanley was lazy from his head to his feet. Albert the elephant passed by one day, and the sloth family tree stood right in his way. An elephant's big, but has tiny eyes. And what happened next should be no surprise. Albert bumped into the tree with a whack. And Stanley fell down onto Albert's broad back. But Albert the elephant had a very thick hide, and he never guessed he'd a sloth for a ride. Stanley said nothing. Too lazy to speak, he stayed for the journey that lasted a week. The jungle was great. It was big, wet, and green, and filled full of creatures our sloth hadn't seen. Thirsty at last from his stomping around, Albert relaxed by a river he'd found. As he knelt on his knees and dipped in his trunk, Stanley slid down with a whoosh and kerplunk. Albert the elephant was too busy drinking to see that Stanley was lazily sinking. Back on the tree, his mom looked around. She looked at the branch. She looked at the ground. She counted her children hung under the tree and said, "Now that's funny. I thought we had 3. Meanwhile, in the river, her son's eyes opened wide. For the sight he took in beat the elephant ride. Stanley was sinking past bright-colored fish, the type you would never see served on a dish. They were stripy and red and yellow and green. The prettiest sight Stanley had seen. He'd now held his breath for a minute or more when a hippo called Jeff pushed him up to the shore. A bird on Jeff's head flew the sloth through the sky, up over the jungle to help his fur dry. Stanley looked down at the rivers and plants and all of the creatures as tiny as ants. He'd never seen anything quite like this view. It beat swimming with fish by 100 times 2. They stopped on a tree where the bird had his nest, and Stanley hung under the branch for a rest. Stanley looked up. He wasn't alone, for here were his family. Stanley was home. He'd had an adventure that couldn't compare. He'd been under the water and had flown in the air. He'd seen all the hustle and bustle and tussle, and he'd done all of this without moving a muscle.